You would open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Ecclesiastes 10. You will recall that last week, as we took a look at the first 12 verses of chapter 9, that Solomon was letting us know about the way that the world looks upside down, as he has in other chapters. But last week he talked about the righteous and the unrighteous and the happy and the sad, and that everybody has a common lot, and that common lot is death. That we're going to die. And he continues that talk this morning in his sermon. My sermon. I continue his sermon this morning. Got my words tangled there. When you get down to the end of chapter 9, he says, and we explained this, we talked about this passage in the article this last Tuesday, but he says, the words of the wise heard in quietness are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. So he talks about fools, and he's mentioned a fool versus someone who is wise earlier in the book. But when we get to chapter 10, he's going to give us really a concentrated talk about fools. And he's going to talk to us about the power of the fool, that a fool has a great amount of power at his disposal. Even though that fool doesn't realize it, he has a great amount of power at his disposal. And we want to take a look at what Solomon has to say about the influence and power of a fool and learn our lessons from that. So we begin chapter 10, verse 1. Dead flies make a perfumer's oil stink. So a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. That's an interesting way to begin talking about a fool. The idea here, though, is that obviously when you're talking about perfume and putting perfume together, one, it's something that's costly, right? You don't get good perfume for cheap. You know, we make fun of stuff like that, right? We got some cheap cologne or cheap perfume. I remember buying something like that when I was in first or second grade, and my family not wanting me to be in the car with them. You know, something cheap. And of course, you got to put on half a gallon, right, to make it work. And not a good thing. The idea, though, is that this is a costly thing. It takes a long time to develop. It's rare, okay? But here comes this fly of what we would say no consequence at all, but that fly flies into the perfume. A couple of them get in there and they die, and now you look at this valuable thing and it's ruined. What lady is going to want to pick those things out, flick them off, and then still dab some on her cheek, right? No. It ruined this valuable thing, and that is what he is saying is what the fool does. You notice that he says a little foolishness, right? A little foolishness. It doesn't take a lot for the fool to come in and destroy that which has been built up, right? That which is put together by great effort and great time, and so the fool ruins these things. He goes on to say, a wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. Now, you and I are conditioned somewhat in our culture to think about the right and the left in politics. And let's be frank, in these 20 verses here, he is really dealing with the idea of politics. And he's dealing with leadership. You notice words like, he says rulers here. He says exalted places, verse 6, princes. He mentions several different things. So, and Solomon, naturally, you can think how Solomon would do so. He's a king. He's dealing with kings from other nations, queens from other nations. He's dealing with princes. And so he sees things in this royal echelon, if you will, that are common really to everybody. But he sees it here with these people who have great influence. Now, when we think about the right and the left, we automatically go to political parties now, don't we? I would imagine that you do that in your mind. But it's really not what he's speaking about here. We're not talking about, you know, the religious right or the radical left, or however the terms that we use it. Really, what we're looking at here is those people who would be on the right is a position of honor. a position of respect, a position of approval, if you will, right? And those people who would be on the left, they are people who are trouble. They don't meet approval of those in front of them. They're ones that miss the mark, if you will. You remember one illustration of this, Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus speaks about what the judgment is going to be like. You remember that he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. What side do the sheep go to? They go to the right, don't they? And then the goats go to the left. This is a position of approval and honor. And that's really what he's saying here when he talks about the right and the left. And so the wise man, he's going in the right direction. He wants to be approved. He wants to meet the approval of those around him. But those who are fools, they go to the left. They don't care. They don't meet with approval by anybody. He goes on and says, even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he's a fool. Well, we got a phrase for that, don't we? It's similar. You can see that idiot coming a mile away, right? I mean, isn't that sort of the language that we use? And we use it metaphorically, of course, but this person so lives in such a way that it's not difficult to see that he's not, if you will, he's not trying, okay? He's oblivious to the fact that he's oblivious. And so you can see him coming a mile away, and that's the idea of what Solomon is saying here. And then he goes on to give this advice. If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position, because composure allays great offenses. Now, there's a great lesson here for you and me. Number one, the ruler in verse 4 is one who is considered foolish, and he's got a temper. Fools do that, don't they? Many times they have a temper. And this temper belongs to the ruler or the king. And so what does Solomon say? When we're in the presence of someone like that, who is a ruler, what does he say? Don't abandon your position. We do that a lot, don't we? In arguments when we're really not mature. You ever do it with your wife, or maybe had it done to you where they come in and the anger is shown and then turn around and walk off? We're not going to work this out like mature adults, right? Solomon says don't do that. When the king loses his temper and he's acting a fool, don't turn around and walk off. Let me ask you, why not? Do you think that the one who's in authority, and you walk off on him, he might get a little bit more upset? And in this case, he has the power to take your life? Yeah, don't walk off. And number two, don't do this. Don't meet anger with anger. Boy, that's a lesson I can learn, right? And I'm sure that everyone in here at some time or another, if you're telling the truth, right, you met anger with anger instead of maintaining calm, instead of maintaining your composure. And what does he say composure does? Composure allays great offenses. Do you remember what Solomon said in another place in the book of Proverbs? A soft answer does what? Turns away wrath. You know, this is a lesson that we can learn very well. And so he says, don't walk away, and don't meet anger with anger, so you can, this composure allays great offenses. Now, think about the influence that the fool has in all these places. And not only that, when we get to verses 5 through 7, we really see the power that the fool has. Look what he says. There is an evil. Again, this is not the word evil like we think. But nevertheless, this is something negative. There's a negative thing. This is a bad thing I've seen under the sun. So it's common with everybody, like we've talked about. Like an error which goes forth from who? The ruler. Folly is set in many exalted places, while rich men sit in humble places. I've seen slaves riding on horses and princes walking like slaves on the land. So here's what we've got. We've got a ruler who is a fool, okay? And the ruler, as the fool, also appoints other people to positions of prominence and authority who are also fools. And Solomon says, I've seen this Everywhere. This is a common lot. Why is it that the man who's qualified and should be in the position of leadership, he's passed over, but the fool who doesn't have a dab of sense, he gets elevated to a position of power and authority? Solomon says this is a common thing. Let me ask you, is this a common thing in our system of government? Oh, yeah. That's easy, isn't it? The thing is, it's common in everyone's system of government, and it has been forever, right? Again, we go back to what Solomon says before. Don't try to figure that out. This is just the way it's going to be. They're going to be fools in power. They're going to be fools in authority. And sometimes you may have to come face to face with them, know how to act when you do so, as he said in the verse before, right? But this is a common thing. And so the fool has power. And he has influence, and he's going to affect those people round about him, and his subjects, if you will. And so, how is it that this fool's going to act? Well, Solomon goes on in verses 8 through, I think I'm going to take it down through verse 11 or so. 8 through 11, we get to see the kind of things that the fool does. You can watch a person like this, and these are trademarks, if you will, of a fool. So, notice what he does. And, I'll say in a minute. He who digs a pit may fall into it. So here we have the person who is digging a hole, a very deep hole. This is a pit, right? So it could be a well, could be something to trap something, doesn't matter what it is. It's a big, deep hole. And the fool is so blind to himself that he falls in his own hole. You ever see the picture of the illustration of the guy that's up in a tree, and you got the big branch out on the tree, and he's sitting on the far side, but he's sawing on the inside, right? That's the picture that we've got here. Absolutely oblivious to what's going on around him. He can't even keep himself out of his own hole. And then he says this, a serpent may bite him who breaks through a wall. Well, this is unique, really, to this time period in this way, in that houses were made of mud and clay and things like this. Snakes would get in the walls, right? It's cool, it's dark. And so it would be common that if you were going to break down a wall and start to work on it, you just don't rush into it willy-nilly. You know that most likely in this climate where they are, you bust a hole in the wall, you're likely to find snakes. And you upset a snake, going to be trouble, right? In a modern day illustration, we might say it's like going into a house and say, I'm going to tear this wall down. I don't know if it's load bearing. I don't know if there's electricity in it. I don't know if there's plumbing in it. I just get my sawzall and start whacking away. Well, that's just stupid. Okay? And that's what he's saying. The fool just, what's the song? Isn't it Elvis, Fools Rush In? Is that it? It's not about this, but we have a saying similar to that, right? And that's what we see here. And then he goes on to talk about some other examples. He who quarries stone may be hurt by them. This guy's so oblivious that he's hammering out a rock that may be above his head, right? Or he's hammering in such a way that you know that as soon as he smacks that chisel, the rock, that piece that comes off, is going to smack him. It's going to hurt him. He's oblivious to what's going on around him. And he who splits logs may be endangered by them. How is that? Well, verse 10, if the axe is dull and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. It's a known thing, right? This is common knowledge, okay? Common knowledge. If you're going to work with tools that have a cutting edge on them, a dull tool is always more dangerous than a sharp tool. Ask a chef. Right? What's the most dangerous thing in the kitchen? A dull knife. Any word worker that works with chisels or planes or anything like that, you don't work with those things because they're extremely dangerous. And you certainly don't grab an axe that you're going to be wielding, Peggy's favorite tool, by the way, and you don't go out and you don't start to use that thing when it doesn't have a sharp edge on it. Right? Because you ever hit a log with a dull axe, that thing will bounce off and hit you. And a lot of times, guess what? Your foot's right there close to it, or your shins. And so, what does he say? Wisdom has the advantage of giving success. The wise person knows, I'm going to take time to prepare. Okay? I'm going to take time to get ready. Before I go digging a pit, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to set up things so I don't fall into it. Before I bust into a wall, I'm going to make sure I go slow and be careful. Before I quarry stone, I'm going to be positioned right. Before I cut wood, I'm sharpening the axe. See, these are common sense things, aren't they? But the fool, he doesn't see any of this. He doesn't understand any of this. He doesn't get it at all. And he goes on to say this, which goes along with it. If the serpent bites before being charmed, there's no profit for the charmer. This fella, this is what a fool looks like. Okay? Now, we see what he looks like. Now, what's interesting to me is that we get to hear a little bit about the way a fool talks. Okay? The way he talks. Well, what he says. Words from the mouth of a wise man are gracious, while the lips of a fool consume him. In the beginning of his talking is folly, the end of its wicked is wicked madness, yet the fool multiplies words. No man knows what will happen, and who can tell him what will come after him? So what's he saying here? Obviously, we know we want words from the wise man. They are, of course, gracious, but the lips of the fool. Now, you've seen someone like this before, right? And maybe you've been this person momentarily, okay, at periods during your life. And understand this. When we talk about these things, we're not talking about someone who makes mistakes, okay, that slips and makes a mistake. We're talking about this is a sustained life. This is the way this person lives. We'll get to that in a few minutes at the end. But, so what's he saying here? The lips of a fool consume him. You ever see someone that, like he says in verse 13, he starts off dumb and he gets dumber, right, as he keeps talking? And verse 14, he can't shut his mouth, or she can't shut her mouth. And so they keep talking, and you can just see the metaphorical shovel, right, as they're digging themselves deeper and deeper and deeper. And the problem is that this fool keeps on talking, and you can't talk to him or her. You can't share any wisdom with them because, after all, they already know it. Doesn't this pretty much describe every teenager in the world? Anyway, the fool keeps talking, and he thinks he knows everything, and you can't break in to talk to him. And that's the idea behind verse 14. No man knows what will happen, and who can tell him what's going to come after him? You could try to interrupt and say, if you keep going on this path, this is what's going to happen. You've seen it with kids before, right? And probably your parents saw it with you. If you started to do a task and your dad could see what was going to happen before it was going to happen, right? And he can break in and say, look, if you do this, this is what's going to happen in the end, and it's going to cause you great grief or pain or injury, right? But this fool, he just keeps talking. Dad, mom, or friend, whatever the wise person is, they don't know anything. And sure enough, they get smacked, they get hurt, they get injured, right? And so you can't tell this person. You can't tell him anything. And this is the type of words and language that he uses. Now, we also get to see his work ethic, or lack thereof, in the last 5 verses. We're going to talk about 4 of them, then I'll hit verse 20 at the end. But we see sort of a work ethic, how he works. Let's see how this man works. The toil, the work of a fool, so wearies him that he doesn't even know how to go to a city. So what's the point? He's out walking on a road, tell me how to get to town, and the guy says, you just keep walking straight on this road and you'll get there. And then he's out wandering around. He gets distracted by everything. He doesn't want to get there because work is there. He's distracted. Okay? He doesn't even know how to get there. And then Solomon says this, woe to you, O land, whose king is a lad, and whose princes feast in the morning. So poor people, right, who are ruled by a young lad is the point, because the lad hasn't lived long enough to have any wisdom yet. And he not only does that, but what does he do? He lives for himself. He's feasting in the morning. Today's a party. Let's get up and party. He's not worried about fulfilling his duties. He's not worried about taking care of his subjects. He's not worried about responsibilities. It's all about, let's just be happy. Let's party. And so woe to the poor subjects who have to live under his authority, right? Let me ask you, ever seen any politicians that fall in that bill? It's under the sun. It's everywhere for all times. What he says next? Blessed are you, O land, whose king is of nobility, and whose princes eat at the appropriate time for strength and not for drunkenness. Here's what we want to see, right? This is what we hope for in our country and in any country who is under a ruler, and that is that we've got a king who is of nobility. That is, this person's come from the right place. He's been educated well. He's got some wisdom, right? And he's leading the people, and he knows how to eat at the appropriate time. Remember that phrase? Appropriate time? Solomon's used it before several times, especially back in chapter 3, verses 2 and following. Okay, so this king, he knows when to do things, right? He's got a sense of decorum, if you will, that says I'm aware of when I need to do certain things, and he knows he doesn't get up in the morning and party. That's not what he does. What does he do? He, of course, says he eats at the right time. And why? For strength and not for drunkenness. So here's what we got. We've got a king who says, okay, my responsibility is over. My princes, my subjects, all of them have gone out. They've worked hard. They come back to the court. And here's what we're going to do. It's time to rest, and let's recharge ourselves. Let's sit down and have a meal, right? We eat for strength. We're not getting together for a drunken orgy. Okay? That's the picture. This is the kind that we want. Now, you know that from these two verses, you know that there are both kinds of leaders in this world, right? We hope for the latter, not the former. But the former are always going to be in many different societies, and we see it in many different ways. And so we see then his poor work ethic. Notice what he says next. Through indolence or laziness, the rafters sag, and through slackness, the house leaks. You ever, and you've probably been this way too, maybe when you were a teenager or younger. See the lazy person who you give a task to do, and they don't want to do it. And so they'll do one of two things, right? They work twice as hard trying to get out of it, right? Or they put on appearances. They go through the motions, but they really don't care. They have no interest in whatever the task may be. And sometimes they get done with the task, and those that have hired them or used their services don't know that the bad work has been done until much, much later. You see the power here? The investment that's gone into maybe building a house like we see here. And what happens? The roof starts to cave in. And the first rain that comes, you're putting out buckets because your brand new place, the bonehead on the roof didn't care, right? He just threw it all together. I remember when we lived in New Mexico, we had swamp coolers there. My dad went up because the swamp cooler went out, and he went to see the wiring in the swamp cooler, and it had been put together with Band-Aids. That's this guy, okay? That's this guy. He's lazy, doesn't want to work, and he doesn't care about work. He doesn't care if it gets done right, okay? And then we see we see the fool's mantra. One of my teachers calls this the fool's song. It has 3 verses to it. It says right here, verse 19, prepare a meal for enjoyment. Wine makes life merry, and money is the answer to everything. Finally, we get the Bible to say what we really want it to say. Money is the answer to everything. Context is all of it, isn't it? So, prepare a meal for enjoyment. This is get it together. I'm a glutton, and I'm just going to keep on stuffing my fat face full, right? And Wine is for merriment. I'm going to stay on the sauce and keep a buzz 24/7. And money, that's where it's at. It is the answer to everything. You can see how this would be foolish talking in contrast to, in light of what God wants, right? But this is exactly what the fool thinks and how he acts. Let me ask you: is this a picture that we find in society here today? Yeah, not just our country, but this is where we live. We see this here, right? So how is it that we take what Solomon has said here? There's a lot of ways we could do it, but how we make application? I think that probably the most obvious one is the one that we go with here, and that is this: as far as we're concerned, don't be a fool, right? Don't be a fool. Now you may say, how do I do that? Well, Proverbs or Psalm 14:1 first of all tells us this: the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. All right? So you want to go down the path of being a fool, deny God's existence. We're surrounded by that today. I read an article yesterday. Yesterday? Day before. Yesterday. Sent to Justin. It just infuriated me, from Los Angeles Times. I'm going to share it with you on Tuesday so it can make you mad too. We'll talk about it though. But the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, right? And so start off that way. When we look over at the book of Proverbs, we find out in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning, right? Is the beginning of knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. You want to be a fool? Get rid of this book. And get rid of the person who, or the one who gave it to us, right? So we want to avoid that altogether. But recognize this, and I really think this is probably where it hits us probably hardest, or maybe it hits me the hardest. And in hitting me the hardest, maybe it'll hit some of you as well. And that is this: we need to recognize, while we're not trying to live a foolish life, sometimes we do foolish things. And one of those foolish things that we do and have to struggle with throughout life is the use of the way we talk and our words. We live in a society that really does a lot of things with words that shouldn't be done. They redefine them, right? We have new definitions. Things have changed just in my lifetime. Several times a word can mean something completely different. We take words and we change them. We make up new words. That's the way societies go. New words are made up all the time, but we make up these new words, and a lot of times our culture makes up words that would be opposed to the meaning of them, as opposed to this book. And it gets a little tricky, right? And then you and I are in danger of, and maybe we are now already, we get numb to some of it. We get desensitized, and things that when you were little or at home with your parents, if you would have said those things, look, my mom was not afraid to use a bar of soap on my mouth. She'd lather that toothbrush up, or she'd have to see teeth marks in it if I got to talking the way I shouldn't talk. There were things that you just didn't say, right, because they were wrong. But now, child's play with what we hear. Look, you and I we've got to understand, we don't want to be like the fool. And when we talk, okay, when we talk in the world and when we talk with each other, and our demeanor when we talk with each other, right, all has a great amount of influence. It has a great amount of power, and it can damage and undo, just like the fly at the beginning, right, that undoes the value of something that's been put together over so long. Our words can do that to us. I want to encourage us not to talk like the fool and to work on the way we talk to each other. It's a constant battle, and it's why James says in James chapter 3, you remember what he says? That the tongue, right, it's a little thing, but man, it starts this fire, and you can't control it. You can't tame it, is what he says. The idea is this: you will never reach a point in your life Never reach a point in your life where you don't have to watch your mouth. Because aren't you like me in this regard, that you do so good for so long and then all of a sudden, man, you can't shut it. Right? Oh, and then you'll kick yourself for the next who knows how many weeks because you just didn't do it. Let's work on that, though, because what we say, not just to each other, but people around us, is going to influence whether or not we get a chance to share this with them. And that's our ultimate goal. We want to talk to people about Jesus Christ and show them that this is not the way a fool travels. This is the way a wise person travels, because he wants to be in a relationship with the all-wise Creator. And so we think of passages like Ephesians 4:29, let no corrupt speech proceed out of your mouth, but only that which is good for edification, that it may give grace to the hearer, right? Let your words be seasoned with grace, right? And on the New Testament gives us how we should talk. The fool, you don't want to be a fool, then talk like this one does. Run your mouth incessantly. Let everyone know you know everything, and they shouldn't even bother. That's the fool's way. Now, as we close this thing out, we also remember this, and we should not forget it. And sometimes maybe we like to put it in the back of our head, but in Matthew chapter 12, the Lord tells us the consequences of words, doesn't he? That when judgment time comes and you and I have to answer, that part of that answer is going to include the words that we use with each other. By your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Now, he was speaking specifically to the Pharisees, but we understand that our speech makes a difference in how we talk. Now, when we close this out, we recognize this about the fool and the wise man. Both of them had influence. Both of them could have power, and both of them could determine their eternal destiny. The choice for that is up to each individual. And Solomon says, if you want to make the right choice, what you're going to do is you're going to fear God. Let God do the talking. Let's shut our mouth and let him talk to us, right? If you're not a member of the body of Christ and you're walking the way of the fool, it's time to change that. Look, the answers are here. God's given them to us. He promises to take your sins away and to add you to the kingdom of Christ. I appreciate what Chuck had to say this morning at Lord's Supper. The great blessing of having the blood of Christ cover our sins. You no longer have to walk like the fool. It's your choice. If you need encouragement, you need prayers, we'll meet you at the back afterwards. Michael's going to lead us in an invitation song. Make sure you let us know. And I hope that each of us will do the best we can to walk the wise path toward heaven. Michael, if you would, won't you stand while we sing?